Okay, so I work for Peace Direct. So Peace Direct supports local peace building organisations in different parts of the world. We look for good local organisations, we ask them what they want, and then we help them to get it. Often that's fundraising, but it's also non-financial support, and it's connecting them to the international community. So the project I want to talk about today is one of our partners called Centre Resolution Conflits, CRC, which is operating in North Kivu in DR Congo. And I'm going to just briefly talk about our history with that partner and show that how a locally led small-scale initiative actually influenced national and international policy. So we came across CRC in 2007. They were brought to our attention by another organisation that had given them conflict transformation training. And we were suggested by that organisation that CRC is a good organisation to work with and could benefit from our assistance. So we engaged with them, we started to look at what kind of work they were doing. The kind of criteria that we look at are things like what is their motivation for doing the work they do. CRC had worked for many years doing peace building work with no funding, so that was a clear indication to us that they were obviously committed to peace building. They had a very good network of volunteers, which suggested to us that they can mobilise communities for peace building and that there was buy-in from the local communities into their projects. So the first step for us to work with a local partner is that we commit them to them for 3 years and we give them $10,000 core grant each year, which is unrestricted. It's unrestricted because we get money from the British public, and that enables us to give a lot of flexibility to how that funding is used. So that enabled us to see what CRC wanted to do. It enabled them to use it for core costs, which enabled them to focus more on actually their peace building activities because they didn't have to worry about salaries, rent of their office, etc. So in time, they began to focus more and more on addressing the issue of armed groups and the proliferation of combatants, the violence they commit on communities that obviously undermines development, creates instability. So what they started to do was look at different approaches for actually reintegrating armed groups and ex-combatants. Because we were giving them quite flexible funding, they were able to trial different approaches and test different approaches and adapt their project as it went along and as they learnt lessons. And what we saw over time was that they began to not scale up in terms of geographical coverage, but scale up in terms of complexity. So they were scaling up the complexity of their program in response to the complexity of the problem. So they started to look at ex-combatants not as an individual target group, but as one vulnerable group amongst many that needed a community-wide approach to actually reintegrate them. There were many socio and economic reasons for them joining armed groups, and there were many reasons that prevented them from reintegrating. So in time, their project developed, it became more complex, it looked at a lot of different issues across the community. So why was this significant? It was significant because there had been huge DDR programs, so DDR being disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration of armed groups, that were internationally led. They were funded by the World Bank, they were managed by the UNDP, and they were based around a partnership between UNDP and the government in most cases. So they'd spent tens of millions of dollars, they targeted 51,000 ex-combatants, but the general consensus was by observers that it actually failed. So at that point we were kind of, okay, well how can we get this very small scale successful model to actually influence some of these very, very large programs which are generally internationally dominated and delivered in quite a political way by the government. So for a small organisation like ourselves, we only have 8 full-time staff in London. We don't have any overseas presence, and an even smaller local organisation, this seemed like quite a big challenge. At the same time, there was a certain donor fatigue because so much money had been spent on DDR and it hadn't been successful. The government had reverted back to quite an aggressive approach to dealing with armed groups, and the armed groups themselves were fed up with these failed DDR processes and false promises. So there was no prospect of DDR, a large-scale DDR program on the horizon. But we knew that as a key peace-building element, you had to have DDR at some point in the future. So what we decided to do was set about understanding why local organisations had not been involved in previous DDR programming. And the reasons for that were that traditionally DDR is seen as a very technical process that operates at a very large scale. It's very politicised, and it's generally something that is sort of taken on by UN agencies. There's also a very little awareness of local organisations and that they're working on DDR issues, and where there was awareness of local organisations, the feeling was that they couldn't operate at the kind of scale that was needed. So based on that understanding, we developed a strategy to try and change some of those perceptions. So first of all, we mapped local organisations across the Eastern DRC that were involved in DDR. We found that there are 15 to 20 organisations that were already doing this kind of work. We looked at the scale that they were operating at. So CRC, our own partner, had integrated 1,500 ex-combatants over a 2 or 3 year period. If you apply that to 15 or 20 organisations, you're beginning to get to about 50% of the target of the previous DDR programmes, sort of 20 to 30,000 ex-combatants. So this gave us confidence that actually a community-based reintegration programme led by local organisations could actually be delivered at the kind of scale that was required. So at that point we thought, okay, well, how do we influence the policymakers? How do we actually get this onto the table? So first of all, we organised a workshop which brought together all of the organisations that we'd identified, and it was to look at best practice around community-based reintegration. So at that workshop we invited some of the key other stakeholders. We invited DFID, we invited IOM, we invited UNDP. And that was an opportunity for us to showcase the work of the local peace builders, to get an intelligent debate between the international community and the local organisations about what was needed, and to actually demonstrate that this is not a ridiculous idea, that it actually could be delivered. DFID significantly then went away and commissioned a community-based reintegration framing paper, and that was their effort, which was a successful effort, to influence the national debate around DDR for the future. After that, the government released its DDR plans, which included community-based reintegration within them. And we also presented a concept paper to the UN Peacekeeping Mission that said, practically how this could actually be done. And that was well regarded and considered their sort of model of choice. So we were quite pleased with this success, from having gone from a very small local organisation that 5 years ago was only had an annual income of $10,000 to influencing national and international policy. I mean, that's not to say that it was the only reason. There was a lot of discourse around doing DDR better internationally. There were already other people thinking around, community-based practices, but there did seem to be a logical process, step-by-step process, which began from this model to the workshop to DFID to commission this paper. So we were pleased with that, but unfortunately there are reasons to continue to be concerned. I'm running out of time, so maybe I won't go on to those, but it demonstrated to us that you can actually take these very small-scale local models and present them to the international community in a way that actually demonstrates how they can be done at scale.